Yeah. And then there's the notice to invite you.
So let's go.
Hello, everybody. I'm Isambard Wilkinson, and today I'm chairing a panel on reportage and exploring non-fiction narratives. I have with me Rania Abouzeid, and I have Suzy, Hansen, and of course Ahmed, Rashid. And hopefully we're going to get down to the brass tacks of what it involves to produce reportage, which is the more immersive bottom down rather than bottom up rather than a top down. And I think Ahmed is already chomping at the bit, but I want to start by talking about Ahmed's book, The Taliban, which of course has become famous. I think it was a New York Times bestseller, sold 1.5 million copies, and was famously on the bedside of a US president. But it didn't start off, it didn't immediately ignite, did it? In fact, no one had heard of the Taliban when they raced into Afghanistan. So if you'd like to take us through how your book began, and then we'll take them.
Well, you know, when I was young, which was a very long time ago, there was a great deal of reportage writing in Pakistan. It was a very healthy tradition, even through the various martial laws. You had journalists who went out into the field, picked up stories like this Sanam has done with Kandil Baloch. This was repeated many times by many journalists, so it was not something exactly new I was doing. Unfortunately now that has been completely crushed because of the situation, because of the media barons not being interested in chasing stories up, and because of the military, which particularly wants a single narrative. It does not want a double, triple narrative. People are writing books about the same topic and saying different things about it. The topic has to be what the state orders. And so we instead of reportage, we now get handouts, and that's what you read in the newspapers. You read the handout given by the Prime Minister or by another minister or someone else. So anyway, I had been covering Afghanistan for many years during the whole Soviet occupation, the withdrawal of the Soviets, and I was a journalist and writing my daily journalist fare. And in 1993, we started hearing about this strange group that had taken over in Kandahar called the Taliban. And I was one of the first journalists to get down there and actually see these people. Now, I knew the Mujahideen, I knew the Afghans. I'd been covering the war for 10, 11 years. And suddenly I came up with this group of people who looked completely weird. They wouldn't let you photograph them. They wouldn't give you interviews. They treated you with complete, the Afghans love the media. They love being photographed. They love giving interviews. And here was a bunch who hated giving interviews. And it took many trips and a lot of effort to finally understand what they were about and what they wanted. And then, of course, they started their wave of conquest through Afghanistan. But this story, I felt, could only be written in a reportage way. In other words, in a manner in which I can't describe them in a sort of empirical way and in a scholarly way. I have to describe them as I see them and as they are. And so what you got was, in the first half of the book, is very much a reportage of how the Taliban behaved, what they look like, etc. And how they operated, how they lived with each other, where they came from. It tries to answer many of the sort of original questions which people wanted. And of course, later on, I realized that this has to be done in a book, because you can't introduce this weird sort of tribal people in a piecemeal fashion. You have to do it properly in a book. And I managed to do that, and then of course nobody would buy the book. And for 2 years, I touted the book around London, New York, and everywhere else. And they said, "Oh, this is rubbish. I mean, who the hell is interested in the Taliban?" And it was a very difficult time. And then about 6 months before 9/11, the book got sold. and in such a manner that actually I had to give up almost all my rights to the book, because the publisher wouldn't publish it in any other way. And he took maximum advantage. So anyway, I mean, the book was finally published, and it came out in hardback just before 9/11. And then, you know, the rest is sort of the story.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Ahmed. So, Rania, so you are a print and a television journalist, and you've just written a brilliant book, in No Turning Back. No Turning Back. And basically, it's been hailed as a reportage of unprecedented scope, and it's extremely engaging, but it's a character-driven investigation. It also seems to be an extremely emotionally traumatic for you. And I wanted to ask you, first of all, why did you choose reportage as a style, as a way of communicating the story which you felt needed to be told?
Well, let me perhaps start with a confession. I didn't want to write a book. I didn't want to write a book about a conflict that I had covered intensely and lived intensely for many years. But I felt compelled to do so after the United Nations stopped counting Syria's dead. And all of a sudden, Syrians weren't even numbers. So imagine that, they weren't even numbers. And that angered me. And, you know, we were seeing these massive waves of Syrians and others fleeing from Syria and trying to get to Europe, many of them drowning along the way. And I thought to myself, if only people knew what some of these Syrians are escaping, if only they really understood why they were so desperate to risk the seas, not just themselves, but with young children, with families, then perhaps they might frame the refugee conversation in a different manner, or perhaps people would look at refugees in a different way. So that's why I thought, okay, let's sit down and reopen these notebooks that I had accumulated over years. And I chose reportage because that's the way I work anyway. I'm a long-form journalist, I write for magazines, and this is the style that I'm familiar with. But the thing was that the story of Syria is about this big. I knew about this much. I had space for that much of the story. So whose stories am I going to tell? I knew that I wanted to present individuals within the context of events rather than focus on the events themselves. So don't come at it from an academic perspective or historical perspective, but come at it from the human perspective, from the individuals, and place them in their environment. And in so doing, perhaps I could explain the environment. And the book is underpinned by an investigation into the arming of the uprising when various states became involved, the Islamists, how they found an opportunity in the chaos of the Syrian uprising to recruit men and money and ammunition to their cause. So you see all of that, but you see it through the stories of people. And I follow a number of individuals for years. But it was when I first started writing this book, or mapping out the book, I had about 10 protagonists, which is nuts. You can't have a book with 10 protagonists because the story of Syria, there were so many different facets, and it was difficult to narrow it down to 4 main characters, and there are other characters who branch off them. And I chose the 4 because they were, some of them, they represent different elements of the uprising, but they are individual stories. I don't want to, you sort of don't want an individual an individual is still, it's still their individual story, even though we're trying to ascribe bigger issues to this individual. So you see what happens to the Free Syrian Army, how it forms and how it dissolves. You see various characters within Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. You see a very idealistic young man who picks up his camera phone and starts recording, and the price that he pays. So you see what happens to civil activists. And you also see war through the eyes of young girls. and what happens to them and how they try and understand and synthesize what is happening over a number of years. And I feel that often in these big foreign policy books, the individuals are lost for those bigger issues, but I think that we can actually use the individuals to explain the bigger issues, and that's what I tried to do in the book.
Thank you very much, Rania. I just want to move this on a little bit, and Suzy, who was a Pulitzer Prize finalist last year for non-fiction, her subject matter took on an interesting, well, a fascinating turn. So basically, you moved to Istanbul. Why did you move to the Muslim world? What was it that?
Well, I mean, the thing is to be honest, I really didn't know what I was doing at the time. I was living in New York. I was about 29 years old, 28, 29 years old. I was an editor at a newspaper, and I myself hadn't actually traveled very much. I had been to Europe, but I didn't know that much, and I had this desire to live abroad and to become a real reporter. I was an editor. I wrote book reviews, but I had not really become a real reporter or learned how to do that. And so I applied for this fellowship to move to Turkey. It was a journalism fellowship where you go abroad for 2 years, you immerse yourself in the country, and hopefully you become some sort of expert. And I chose Turkey for a practical reason. One was that I noticed at the time in 2007 not that many people were, I mean, Turkey was not in the press that much. Of course, we were much more fixated on Afghanistan and Iraq, and of course we would be. But I noticed that maybe it was an opportunity. There was another reason, though. My favorite writer at the time was James Baldwin. And I feel like Baldwin explained to me, as I think he does for many white Americans, what it actually means to be white. And it was kind of that reading experience where your mind opens in a totally different way. And I was very curious about why he lived in Istanbul for 10 years, on and off for 10 years, because it's not very well known about him. But he had said that he felt more comfortable as a black gay man in Istanbul than he had in Paris or New York. And again, it was another one of those moments where Istanbul became this place in my imagination that I very much wanted to understand. And I wanted to understand Turkey, but okay, of course I moved there, and I start this process that we all go through of starting to learn about a foreign country. I had read a lot before I got there, but I was only learning the language as I got there, so this was a very, very slow process. And I was exhilarated at first, but then of course I very quickly crashed because I realized how little I knew, not only about the country that I was supposedly going to be writing about, but about my country's history with that country. And as I talked to Turks, you know, of course, this history came out very naturally. It was nothing that they were kind of bringing up in a very focused way. It was just sort of like, of course, we've had this long history. I knew about the Marshall Plan. I knew about the Truman Doctrine. I knew that Turkey and America had this history. But like many Americans, these are not histories that we are taught in school, and it's not taught that it's sort of incumbent upon us to understand this relationship. And what I started realizing as I was in Turkey and trying to understand it and failing, and as I was in Greece, and I also went to Egypt, and I also went to Afghanistan, and this is again as a young magazine reporter, that again and again, I lacked the knowledge that was necessary to not only understand that country, but understand my own views, my own prejudices, my own flaws in thinking. Because if I didn't understand this relationship between these countries that has existed for so long, which was a power relationship, then I didn't understand the things that had produced my own mind and my own psychology and my own ideas about myself as an American, America as a country, and America's role in the world. So I felt that even though I wanted to write a book about Turkey, that first what I had to do was break down these assumptions, that I had to kind of break down my entire mind, essentially, to be able to see a country on its own terms. And the book ends up being kind of a critique of American journalism in some ways, because I think we suffer from a lot of these blind spots.
It would be great a bit later to get into some of the detail of what you felt were your flaws, and perhaps how much your thinking was also influenced by Edward Said, who began to examine Western perceptions, particularly when we report on the Islamic world. Now, Ahmed, I mean, you've sort of indicated that when you first were investigating the Taliban, they were incredibly difficult to penetrate, even to approach. Could you tell us what sort of investigative or journalistic techniques, or indeed human techniques, you used to win their confidence and to learn about what was going on?
Well, there were very few journalists going into Afghanistan in the 90s. It was not a sexy subject anymore. Editors were not willing to publish stories about it. Even the stories that I wrote were spiked quite often. They weren't published or printed, and it became very difficult. But in a sense, it was really just persistence. I mean, I would go down to Kandahar to see them every 2 or 3 months. And they finally, got used to me, but it took a long time. I wrote a subsequent book after 9/11, trying to track down the leadership of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which was one of the Al-Qaeda groups very active in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Central Asia, and in particular the leader of this, who was a very charismatic figure, but nobody had actually ever interviewed him, Juma Namangani, who was eventually killed by the Americans during 9/11. And I mean, I never got to meet him at the end. I mean, he died, I never got to meet him. I tracked him down into the mountains in Tajikistan, into villages where he'd been staying, and where his guerrillas were, etc. But I mean, that's an example of not being very successful. But the story is quite something, and I got to learn a great deal about the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and that's why I want to say, I read Rania's book a couple of weeks ago, and it's one of the most remarkable books I've read, because she is really following the lives of 8 or 10 people through a war. I mean, you've read books like, people following people's lives in a non-war situation in America, in some backwood, etc., or amongst ethnic groups. You get books about blacks and all who trace their lineage back to Africa or back to wherever they were when they were slaves. But you never get the idea of reporting the lives of people. And their lives, I mean, the remarkable thing about her book is that their lives are constantly changing, because they're guerrillas, they're with the regime, they're against the regime, then they're tortured, they're arrested, they're dealt with brutally, their families murdered, then they manage to get out, and they get out to Turkey, or they try and get out to Europe. And so there's a constant movement, and that is really what I would call first-class reportage, because you have the ability to not just track down individuals over a long period of time in the middle of a war, but you also are describing the changes in their own lives and in their own personalities. I mean, she writes at times about people who she knew 2 years ago, and when she meets them again, they've changed. Well, obviously they've changed, because they've been tortured or they've been imprisoned or whatever it is. So I think that kind of reportage is really brilliant.
And now you've outlined the detail, or some of the detail of the book. It would be interesting to know, how did you, with this very harrowing, these harrowing experiences that you witnessed, how did you manage to keep a distance, or did you not keep a distance? Where did you draw the line between objectivity and subjectivity?
First of all, if I may just say that what Mr. Ahmed Rashid said is one of the honors of my life. Thank you so much for those kind words. Your books are on my shelves, and you're the gold standard of this kind of work. Descent into Chaos is just masterful, and it taught us so much. So thank you very much. It's hard when you're talking to people on the worst day of their lives. When you're in a hospital field, it's not even a hospital, it's a field clinic, because the hospitals are being bombed. So you're in a converted apartment that is now a field clinic with meager supplies. I was in field clinics that didn't even have anesthetic, and you see kids being operated on. As a human being, you can't but feel something. And if you don't, then you're in trouble, and you need to seek help. So it's hard. As a human, of course, you're going to take all of that stuff in. If a little girl reaches out her hand, and this happened many times, you take it. You put your notebook down and you hold her hand while she's in that field clinic waiting for her parents, if they're still alive, to come and get her. It's difficult. There's no other way to say it, except it's difficult. It's really hard, and it takes something from you. It does.
And did you feel yourself becoming more, or having to guard against becoming more biased to one group or another, or that you were sort of some sort of...
No, no. Well, to start with, I was banned by the Assad government. I learned about it just by chance. I learned that I was banned in the summer of 2011 and wanted by 3 of the 4 main intelligence agencies, and I learned that by chance because Syrian activists at the time would bribe some people in the regime to find out if their names were on the wanted list. This wasn't a case of, you know, they issue a summons and they knock on your door and you know that you're wanted and you're going to go to court. No, 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 you have no idea. You just get picked up at a checkpoint and that's it. And you might disappear. So, so one day, over Twitter actually, one of the activists started sending me little DMs and about charges, you know, Rania Abouzeid, who has this telephone number and this nationality, is wanted for this, that, and the other. I thought it was a joke initially, I really did, until I saw the case file numbers at the end and I realized that this was real. So I couldn't access that side for many, many years. I mean, I did eventually get back on 2 occasions, but I didn't have the same level of access on that side. They locked me out. So I had to focus on the other side. But, you know, the guys on the other side knew that, you know, if I felt I was being spun, I was going to get up and walk. And they knew that. I mean, sometimes I remember I did, I wrote one of the first story that mapped out, this was in 2012, it mapped out what the Saudis and the Qataris and the Turks were doing when they started arming different rebel battalions. And it was you know, it took me a couple of weeks to investigate this stuff out and to nail it down. So, you know, after the story was published, I went back into Syria, and some of the guys there, some of the rebel commanders were like, oh, everybody's talking about your story, you know, and so is really upset and blah, blah. And I was like, what part of it isn't true? Point me to what part of it isn't true. And I used to use that all the time. I'd get hauled in for rebel interrogations when they didn't like something that I'd written. And I'd say the same thing. You knew I was a journalist. I never hid that from you. I reminded you of that during interviews. You said this. What part isn't true? And the truth was my defense. And that helped me. But no, I mean, no, the guys knew. If they started like trying to spin me, I was going to walk. And I did on a number of occasions.
And this very fine line between how much you write yourself into the story, how did you judge where to leave the impact that it had on you, and how much did you leave in? Where did you draw that line?
No, it's not about me at all. It's not my story, it is theirs. And I say that on page 1. This is not a story about my experience of the Syrian uprising. It's a Syrian book about Syrians, because I think that too often foreign correspondents go to a place and we get their reporter's journal. With all due respect, you know, I love reading memoirs, I really do. I love reading memoirs, but Syrians are not the background in their own story. They are the story.
Excellent. So I'd like to sort of switch it back, looking from the other perspective. When, as you say, as a writer, we have to be aware of where we're coming from, our prejudices, what is colouring our viewpoint. Can you take us through some of the things that you found in your own sort of background closet that needed sort of airing and examining?
Well, so the book includes some history and includes literary criticism as well. There's kind of a bunch of things in there trying to sort of figure out what is this American psychology that we bring to the rest of the world when we go out into it, finally, if we do. And I think that one thing I discovered is that a lot of us are still very much formed by the Cold War. We very much have Cold War minds. And I think the legacy of modernization theory is very, very intense, in fact, which, if you don't know, was an actual policy in the 40s and early 50s, in which the Americans thought, okay, well, you know, we have the whole world at our feet here, and we're going to go in and we're going to try to make them more like us. And this was a policy that played out in places like Turkey and places like Iran, I think in part, you know, a little bit in Pakistan. And I think that language that was used, you can go back and you can, because it was like a set of data points. It was like, can you know, let's encourage everybody to be like this and be like this. Will they urbanize? Everybody should urbanize. Everybody should be on time. You know, this kind of these very strange ideas that you can see if you look at the literature. And I think that language that was used, which very much has this kind of, are you catching up with us? You know, the ones who are at the end of the evolutionary spectrum, or are you behind us? And I think that you can see that language still. I mean, it's getting better. But I found that if I can give two quick examples in my own case, and very much my book is an embarrassing litany of terrible confessions. But I think with Erdogan, first of all, I arrived in 2007. And if you remember, this was the time when everyone was excited about, well, not everyone, but there were a lot of people who were sort of excited about him as this kind of solution for the Muslim world in the way that, you know, the Western press looks for those things. And I think that everybody was kind of consumed by this debate between Islam and secularism in Turkey, and that kind of dominated all of the reporting at the time. And then 7 years later, there was a fire in a mine in not inner Anatolia, but sort of closer to the Aegean side, and 301 men died in this mine fire. And at that point, everyone was sort of reckoning with the fact that this was a result of Erdogan's privatization policies, and of the fact that workers' rights and safety regulations had been completely neglected in all of that time. And I attribute that very much to the fact that I think people were carried away. I think a lot of people were blind to what he was actually doing in the country and to his actual economic policies, because all they were concerned about was, is he a dangerous Islamist in some way? And I do think for a lot of Western reporters, the fact that he was a capitalist, and even if these reporters are leftists, even if they are critics of capitalism in their own countries, there is something where they feel this kind of comfort in the idea that, oh, well, you know, he's big business, he's pro-business, he's going to be sort of more like us. And no one would admit this, but I think it's happening in the background. And so, you know, I think that a lot of people, you know, failed to kind of look at actually how the guy was changing the country, which we're seeing now.
And just to speak a little bit more about your book, so when you sort of lay the ground with examining your own perspective, and what is your thesis about Turkey and Erdogan? What's the sort of a narrative drive throughout your book?
Well, I mean, I take you through basically the 8 years that I'm still living there. But I think one thing that I can throw out there about Erdogan, for example, is that, you know, he's thought of also as sort of, sometimes people talk about it as if, well, Erdogan has turned back the clock, and, you know, the country used to be secular and he has destroyed that secular regime. And in fact, when you do start to look at the history again, because it's just so important, obviously, Erdogan, you could argue, and I think a lot of leftists in Turkey argue, that Erdogan's generation very much was formed by the 1980 coup, which was a coup to overthrow or to stop the violence in Turkey, which was mostly leftist, rightist violence. So again, this was the Cold War. And the secular generals stepped in, and they were very afraid of the communists, or the supposed communists, or the socialists, and they threw a lot of them in jail. And a lot of people think of that coup as if it was an anti-Islamist coup, but it had nothing to do with it. In fact, what actually happened was that the generals thought, okay, communism is very dangerous, and, you know, our allies, the United States, you know, don't want to make sure that we take care of our leftist problem, and so we're going to increase a kind of like suffuse into the country a kind of soft Islam, which I think a lot of people are probably familiar with this policy, and Erdogan, at the same time, the Americans were in particular encouraging Turkey to institute more capitalist policies. And Erdogan is very much an outgrowth of that period. And that's a narrative that I think people don't tend to know as much about Turkey, and I think that Americans who think of him as like, okay, now he's just a crazy Islamist, they don't realize that what produced Erdogan very much came out of American policies.
I'd like to pick up that point of misperceptions by Western policymakers, of which you've had some truck with. And first of all, if you could, did your book, The Taliban, how did it influence, for better or for good, for example, the Pentagon or Washington? And I mean, what sort of effects do you think your book had?
Well, I was summoned to all sorts of, capitals around the world, especially Washington and London, and asked for what should be done. And I said very simply that what needs to be done is the Afghan economy needs to be revived, and that can be done through agriculture, and it can be very cheaply done. And you need a good disarmament program starting with the UN. And various other suggestions, none of which were adopted by the Bush team, especially in the Pentagon. The British were more amenable to it, but the Americans weren't. They were obsessed with getting bin Laden, and nothing else mattered. And very soon I found out that they were actually planning to invade Iraq, and so there was no question of pursuing a proper state-building, nation-building program in Afghanistan. And remember, at that time, after 9/11, there was 2.5 years of relative peace. I mean, this was the time when you should have done all the reconstruction and built the army up and built the security forces and trained the Afghans and etc. And instead, nothing was done. Absolutely nothing. Except, the Pashtuns were bombed mercilessly because they thought that the Taliban were hiding, the remnants of the Taliban were hiding in amongst the Pashtuns. And then the Taliban, the remainder who were living in Pakistan were then mobilized by the Pakistani military to revamp themselves as the Taliban and take on the Americans. And the reason for that simply was because the Pakistanis were convinced that the Americans were going to leave and abandon Afghanistan. And so the best way to keep their attention in Afghanistan was to start a little uprising against them, which is what the Taliban did, and grew into what we have today, which is more, it's a massive uprising. So it's not, this was not a scholarly work. I visited all the scholarly places and gave lectures and all the rest of it. But there was a certain disdain that we, in a sense, the scholars got it all wrong, and they couldn't foresee that something like this was about to happen. This book, by the way, also foresaw that bin Laden would attack America, and also had a whole chapter on bin Laden, which at that time very few people knew who he was and what he was doing. So I think the real tragedy is that Reportage is not taken seriously. I'm sure that's the same for you with this book. I mean, it's not that Reportage lacks analysis. People somehow think, you're writing about some problem of some poor family that's been killed or destroyed or whatever, and that there's no analysis to go with it. Well, I think if you read, Rania's book, my own books, the analysis is still very much there. But it's done, the analysis is done in a way which is understandable for the majority of people. It's not done in an esoteric, scholarly way which nobody understands. And it fits into the reportage, quite well, I think. A good writer will make sure that reportage actually includes very sufficient and well thought out analysis, but simply put.
Rania, could you tell us some more about the people who you write about? Who did they represent in terms of factions or cities, and where they are today? Where is their story today?
Just to follow on from what Ahmed said about how you can meld a person's story with the analysis. One of the main characters in my book is a man I call Muhammad, And the first time you see Muhammad, he's being released from prison. And this is in early 2011. And I included Muhammad in the book because Muhammad goes on to become an Jabhat al-Nusra emir. And Jabhat al-Nusra was the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate. But his story is rooted in a much earlier period in Syrian history, in the 1980s, when Bashar al-Assad's father and predecessor, Hafiz al-Assad, basically destroyed the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, which at the time was fighting an Islamist insurrection against the Syrian state. And Muhammad was a young boy, he was about 6 or 7, and he remembers the roundup of the Muslim Brotherhood members, sympathizers, neighbors, anybody. Hafiz al-Assad tried to basically uproot any element that might be sympathetic or that might be fertile ground for the Muslim Brotherhood to plant itself after he destroyed them. So there was an entire generation of young men like this man Muhammad who remembered that, and they carried that with them. So, that's one way that reportage gives you the space to both tell the personal story and to meld it with the historical context so that you can understand why a person is doing this. You can understand what radicalized this young man and how he became progressively more radicalized and how he used that hatred, that anger, that revenge that he had in his heart to play his part in what happened in Syria in the past few years.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the panelists for giving us a great insight into the gritty business of reportage and how it is such a powerful tool but somehow fails to persuade power. But I'm sure there are quite a few questions from the audience, so please, I think there should be a microphone or two circulating. So if you could... far away.
Could I pick up Ahmed's point that military... Could I start by picking up Ahmed's starting point of his discussion that the military wants one single unified narrative and connect it with Rania's predicament of being banned while reporting? And if I could also connect it with Suzy's narrative that you are either with us or with them? And if I could stretch the argument that, as reporters, how do you cope with the pressure or the imperative of state-approved reportage, coverage, narrative building? How does it affect your work, mobility, and how to cope with the pressure, the external pressure of state-approved coverage or reportage?
Do you want to answer your...
I can talk about Turkey, working in Turkey, you mean. I don't really have any problems there recently. I mean, for Turkish journalists, working there is very, very, very difficult, and they basically have either been put in jail or they have lost their jobs or they have left the country. For foreign journalists, they pretty much just kind of leave you alone. There are certain red lines, I think, going to the Kurdish regions, but I don't have to really think about those kinds of things. So.
And could you just briefly restate your question to Ahmed very epithily?
The mic is not working. Yeah.
Ahmed's starting point of discussion was that within the sensitivity of this area, the regional politics of Pakistan, there is this imperative that military wants a single narrative. I wanted to stretch his statement, his observation, that while probably exercising your jobs as reporters, perhaps you do encounter a certain kind of censor or imperative or pressure of state-approved art, and how you cope with that.
Okay, thank you very much.
How does it affect your work?
Well, I think at this time in Pakistan there's a huge amount of self-censorship. There's censorship by the media barons who are getting the word from above that they should tone down their coverage, whatever. Remember, we have 50 TV stations, we've got dozens of newspapers, and all of them, unfortunately, what you're seeing now, even compared to the 80s, when reporting was alive and well under Ziaul Haq, which was the worst, which was considered one of the worst periods for the press. Journalists were flogged, newspapers were burnt, newspapers were forbidden from coming out for days on end. Their advertising revenue was stopped. Yet even in those days, there was full-scale reporting as to what was going on inside the regime, outside the regime. You now have a situation where if you dare report what is happening inside the regime, if one minister has a different point of view from another minister, or a general is disagreeing with the prime minister, you can go to jail. Now, I mean, the bottom line of media freedom is that, you are allowed to, according to the Constitution, allows freedom of press, freedom of expression, and that is just being completely ignored. And the other factor, of course, which is very important, I think, is this, especially when, older journalists coming from this tradition of reportage and writing everybody's point of view and what they think, and then suddenly you're told, no, there's only one point of view. We're at war with India right now, so that's it. You can't talk about, can anyone say that the Islamic extremists who carried out the act in India could possibly have been trained in Pakistan, and shouldn't these training camps or leaders or whatever, shouldn't they be shut down? Shouldn't they be, you can't say that. You won't see a newspaper saying that. Everybody's into the jingo scene. Of course, it's even worse in India, where the press is even, in my opinion, less free than in Pakistan. The Indian jingoism right now over this Indo-Pak conflict is huge, and certainly that's something that could, push this regime into a more open conflict.
Sorry, do we have another question? Yeah, and the microphone. The microphone's not on.
You're a leading expert on Taliban, rather from your book, The West Knew About Taliban.
I can't see.
What do you...
Stand up.
Yes. I'm saying you're a leading expert on Taliban. Your book was widely read. Rather, through your book, West came to know about Taliban and extremism. So now again, presently, Taliban and negotiation between the Afghan government has taken the center stage. What do you think? It will be fruitful, productive now at this stage? And then my small question to you, Syrian uprising is a continuation of failed Arab Spring, and so many powers were involved there. Russians were involved, Iraqis were involved, Iranians, the extremists and the ISIS. What do you think? Who were the most brutal and most extreme who did brutality there?
The Syrian uprising began in March 2011, and if we remember the context of the Middle East at the time, by March, the Tunisian leader had fled, the president had fled, and Hosni Mubarak of Egypt had resigned. So these were momentous events. These were events that just a couple of months prior, I think if you'd asked any Arab, they would think they were impossible to remove these leaders who seemed cemented to life. So it was within that context that things started to move in Syria. Syria became a proxy war for the world. I mean, you mentioned the Russians, the Iranians. There was also Lebanese Hezbollah on Assad's side. There were Afghan mercenaries who were brought into the fight. There were Iraqi Shia militias as well. And on the other side, there were the ultra-conservative jihadi Islamists who flooded in. And they came from everywhere. They came from not just the Arab states, as you know. There were Pakistanis. I met Pakistanis there. There were Central Asians from all over Central Asia, the Chechens, the Russian republics, the federations, as well as the Europeans and the Westerners, and they came for various reasons. And as for brutality, I mean, look, no side has clean hands.
Yeah, sorry, what is the question?
About the Afghan negotiations now, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful. I mean, I think there are a lot of factors present right now which were not present earlier when Obama tried, and even earlier than that. I think the first factor is that there is an exhaustion on both sides. Both sides have taken huge casualties. We know about the regime casualties, but we are not often told about the Taliban casualties, but they are very, very large. And I think the driving force for more, what I would call the more moderate or sensible Taliban, is that any conclusion to an end to this war is going to need a lot of money, in the sense that the Afghans are completely penniless right now. They're going to continue needing $5 to $10 billion a year to sustain themselves. And if you have a Taliban which goes for total victory, and then antagonizes the entire international community, you're not going to get that money. And so for the Taliban, the best thing is to go into some kind of coalition with the Kabul government and to give some encouragement to the international community that please, until we get our economy going and our house in order, we're going to need money, please help us give money. And I think that should be Pakistan's driving force also. Because the last thing we want or need is for a resurgent Taliban having a capital in Kabul, becoming dependent once again on Pakistan. Refugees coming here, the Taliban demands for money, and if we don't give, blackmailing and kidnapping and all the rest of it, and of course drugs. But even drugs, is not capable of sustaining the entire Afghan economy. So I am a little more hopeful, and I just hope that Trump, doesn't pull the plug on these negotiations too early. He can wake up tomorrow morning and write a tweet and say, "I'm withdrawing all the American forces from Afghanistan," and he'll leave all his commanders in the lurch. That's the real fear. The real fear, once again, unfortunately, is American stupidity. That they will do something really stupid, which even his own people won't support. But he's told his supporters that I'm going to get out of Afghanistan, and he really intends to do that. I just hope he gives enough time for these negotiations to carry on.
We have another question here, please.
My question is more financial. When people like you go into countries, is it that you are men and women of means and you can afford to, have this, like you say, spirit of adventure or wanderlust, or, you just want to go and find out what's happening and you have the leisure to come back and write this book? How do you manage doing that? Is it your newspapers, or who pays for all of this?
I have a feeling that Rania is very keen to jump in here.
Gosh, where to start? So this is a crying session? This is the crying part of the session now?
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I'm not a person of means. I am a freelancer, which means I work per piece, which means I'm always struggling financially. I'm basically a garment worker of the journalism industry. That's what I am. So no, I don't have, I don't think that any of us do it for the money, really, because what money? There is no money. No, I think that I'm sure that I speak for everybody on the panel when we say that this is, we're driven by curiosity, by a passion to know and then to inform, so that other people can know. But it's certainly not money, no.
Ahmed, would you like to say something about that?
In Pakistan, we face a different issue, that being able to do local investigative reporting and reportage is not difficult, and it's not particularly expensive. You can do that. Certainly going into Afghanistan is expensive. Going to Central Asia is expensive. So I was fortunate that I was writing both for the local press, at that time The Nation, and the foreign press. And the foreign press, if you like, paid my bills. They allowed you to, they wanted you to travel, they allowed you to travel, and they would foot bills which the local press could not. But I mean, local journalism has simply suffered because nobody is willing to fund, particularly what Rania is saying, long-form journalism, investigation into what's going on, and the self-censorship is rampant, and the whole sort of journalist venue is getting stricter and tighter and more difficult to break out of.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nightmare for journalists right now, and especially for people covering war. I mean, especially during the Syrian war, it seemed like the funds were really diminishing at that time, and people needed security, and what they were doing was absolutely astonishing. And I also work. I mean, I did not cover the wars, but I also worked piece by piece. And I think we're all kind of just constantly trying to see. The one thing that you have in the U.S., I will say though, that makes a lot of Americans very privileged, are these fellowships and these kinds of grants, and there is this kind of system that produces these things, but you apply every year and you hope that you'll get one of them and that will sustain you, but it gets worse and worse every year. It's very difficult to do.
We have a question here.
So my question is a bit general question about reportage, and I got to read your book, Descent into Chaos, and when I started, it was this narrative about one aspect of what is happening in the world, or if it's the Syrian aspect of it, or if it's, Turkey, the misconceptions about Turkey. So how does this form, reportage, help in the broader narrative of documentation or history narratives? Because it's something very specific to a few situations. You write about one situation, a whole book, because I'm new to this and I have difficulty navigating the pathways. So could you shed a bit light on how it helps?
I think that, especially if you're dealing with some of the issues like Turkey or Afghanistan, Pakistan, Syria, they're complicated and there are many, many players. And I think that one of the easier tools that we have in our kit to explain it is to tie it to people, tie it to individuals who you can relate to. So there's something that you can relate to, even if people are like the Muhammad character in my book, who is not a very nice guy, but you can still understand how he came to be what he came to be. And in tying it to a person, then you can help explain some of the bigger issues. And it's a way of simplifying the complicated, but also presenting the complicated in a more simplified manner, if that makes sense.
Well, I always say that reportage is journalism from the bottom up. In other words, you are dealing with people, realities on the ground, people's lives, and what is happening on the ground. And then you move up into the realm of analysis and trying to explain this and broadening it out. What are the regional implications? What are the international implications? Issues of policy and all the rest of it. And a lot of scholarship today is top-down. Top-down meaning you're dealing with ideologies and trends and all that. And really there's very little mention of the people, the economics of how states are surviving. Reportage is bottom up, and a lot of scholarship, unfortunately, is only top down. It would be beneficial if it was a little more mixed.
We have a question here.
My question is for Suzy Hansen. I recently read your article in The Guardian, Unlearning the Myth of American Innocence. I think it's the same all over the world. A common person doesn't really know beyond his own little bubble. You've mentioned that you unlearned the myth by traveling and moving abroad. So even though you were and are a journalist, but for a common person who's not really fortunate or privileged enough, how do you think they would unlearn the myth for their own?
Well, it was why I wrote the book, actually, because I thought I had this really privileged, I did have a very privileged experience. I won this fellowship. I got to move to a country for 2 years. I ended up staying. That was not the plan. They did pay me. I had all this time to read. I mean, who has just this kind of endless time? And I was 30. I wasn't really that young. I had this chance to kind of learn about all of these things. And part of the reason why I tell the arc of the first 7 years, my first 7 years in Turkey in the book, is because I wanted to start out as that kind of innocent person. I exaggerated a little bit, and then show that process of education so that people could maybe have it themselves, those who don't get to move abroad and who don't get to have the same privilege and endless time to read and all of these things. There's a lot of books in my book because I include a lot of reading in the book. But I will say something, I do think it's a little bit different. I mean, people disagree with me about this. Americans, the difference with Americans and their innocence is if they are in a kind of denial about their own involvement in the rest of the world, and they are in denial of the fact that, you know, the U.S. has been a kind of empire. And so I think it is incumbent on them to be disabused of their innocence, and that it is a responsibility that they have now and forever.
Do we have any further?
I have a question.
Yeah, I think we'll take one or two more questions and then we'll wrap up.
I have a question for Ma'am Rania. You went to Syria and you saw the war. I read somewhere that the first casualty of the war are the women. So I just want to know your side of the story, that how it affected the women of Syria. Sir Rashid, Sir Ahmed, sorry, I want to ask, when I'm a student of journalism, and I want to know that there is a debate in journalism while you are reporting for war, you have to keep in mind the national interest of your country. For instance, if you are involved in that war. And as a reporter, when you go to the war zone, your country is protecting you, and this question is for Ma'am Rania as well, like your country is protecting you, they are making sure that you're secure in the war zone. So how much it tarnishes your perspective, how much it molds your perspective. And my question to Ma'am Suzy is, like, in Trump's era, do you think that America is ready to unlearn that Orientalist perspective that you try to unlearn, but do you think that in this era, now America is ready to unlearn? Thank you.
Do you want me to just,
Yeah, do you want to go in?
Yeah, I'll just answer that real quick. I actually, this is my one hopeful thing about Trump, is that as we can see, he's kind of pushing all of this stuff out into the open. I think if Clinton had been elected, we would have gone on in this way that we had been going on for a very long time, and now we have this obnoxious man to air all of our dirtiest laundry, and it's awful and it's painful, and I hope that it doesn't become more violent than it already has become, of course, but I do think that if it hadn't happened, we really wouldn't have gotten anywhere, and in some ways we might end up thanking him. But the important thing is, you know, what are we going to do with this? Are we going to be able to actually invent a new idea about ourselves? Or are we going to just say, oh my God, that was a terrible just little blip in history, and let's just go back to our exceptional selves? Which I'm very afraid, actually, that a lot of the liberals will do. But hopefully they can be braver than that.
Your question about the women in Syria. There were women on the front lines of protests. There were women who were smuggling weapons in their cars through government checkpoints. There were, there were women who were involved in many things, but not necessarily the fighting, except some of the Islamic State women, but there's something else. It's the men who make war, and it's the women who hold the society together, and who hold the family together, and who hold the fears of their children. And it's the women who have to clean up the men's mess, basically. And that happened in Syria just as it happens in other places. And my countries, because I have several, they didn't know what I was up to. They don't support me. They don't. I'd like to think that if I were held in a prison cell in Damascus, that somebody would ask for me. But especially Lebanese, because I'm Lebanese Australian, so I'm Eastern Western. The Lebanese part of it, there were Lebanese parties on both sides of the Syrian conflict. So I'm upsetting somebody, regardless of what I do. So no, it's not that we go there with their permission or with their protection or anything like that. It's we're on our own, unless we get into trouble. And even then, they might not help us.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to wrap things up there, but thank you very much to the audience for spending a day indoors on what could be a beautiful day outside, and also to thank my co-panelists for a riveting discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.